Okay, welcome everyone to our monthly edition of the University of Idaho, Utah State University, and South Dakota State University Sheep and Goat webinar series. Today, we're lucky enough to have with us Dr. Scott Beaudridge from West Virginia, and he has a pretty substantial history, both in academia and his fields, and then also with our sheep industry. He is alumni from Chico State University, University of Maine, Virginia Tech, and New Jersey Medical and Dental School. Um, he focuses his research to help small ruminant producers and has a wealth of knowledge surrounding immune function using different hair sheep breeds and then in comparison to some other wool type breeds. I've recently met Dr. Beaudridge at the American Lamb Board Summit this year. And then again, he came to the St. Croix workshop that we had here at Utah State University. It's been a pleasure. He's a wealth of knowledge, and I'm excited to hear him today. And with that, we'll go ahead and turn the time over to Dr. Beaudridge as he discusses selecting for healthy sheep is within your grasp. So thank you, Dr. Beaudridge.
Thank you for the introduction, Chad. It's a pleasure to talk with everybody, even though I can't see your face. It's always different with webinars, but so I'm super excited about this, not only because it's kind of my research area, it's just since we met at Lamb Board and since I've been out to Utah, we've processed like 750 serum samples from sheep all over the place, and we're already getting some really good information back. So let me kind of go back in time and tell the story a little bit. I mean, my background's really in evaluating parasite resistance. So when I moved from California to Maine, I met some guys out there that were doing research in parasite resistance in sheep. And this is it's about 25 years ago when they were starting to upgrade the Katahdin with the big project that was being done in Maine at the time. So we think about it this way. Let me kind of go on. I'm really focused on one parasite, and that's kind of where all of this starts. So it deals with animals and their kind of exposure and response to the parasite Haemonchus contortus. So the real simple life cycle, the parasite is shed in the feces. It establishes through 3 different larval molts in the environment, and then the infective larvae are consumed by the host. They travel to the final compartment of the ruminant stomach, which is the abomasum. Those larvae then, from time of consumption to adults mating, is about 2 to 3 weeks. And those adults will feed on blood anywhere right around 50 microliters of blood a day. 50 microliters doesn't really mean anything to anybody, so I always multiply it by 1,000. So if you have 1,000 worms, they're going to take about 50 milliliters of blood a day, or about the size of a Dixie cup in a dentist's office. So that much blood being consumed every day. Big sheep, not really a problem. 50-pound lambs, that's where it starts hurting all of us. What's made this even worse is drug resistance. And I don't care where you are in the U.S., it has happened. So we're going to use a story from where I came from in California. One of my friends from my livestock judging team at Chico State, she was a high school ag teacher in Oakdale, California, and she needed a high school science fair project for her students. So I said, there's a bunch of club lamb operations right around where you are. They're all on irrigated pastures. You should have a pretty good parasite load. Let's see what those parasites are resistant to. So they looked at sheep. They took fecal A counts from sheep that were on that system when they dewormed, and then they took another fecal A count 2 weeks later. So what we found with that is that there was a 40% increase in fecal A counts 2 weeks after they received an albendazole or valbazin treatment. So the fecal A counts went up after they got dewormed. There was also just a 16% decrease in fecal A count after cydectin treatment. So neither cydectin nor valbazin, in this case, was effective at managing parasites on club lamb type ewes and irrigated pastures in Central California. How do you make that relevant to the Intermountain states and other parts of the western U.S.? If you're grazing irrigated pastures, I dealt with some producers in kind of South Dakota area that were losing quite a few lambs monthly, right? One lady called me that lost 200 lambs in 1 month after they dewormed them. So it's a serious issue, and it's not just located in the southeastern United States anymore. We're seeing it across the country. So that's where we're headed with this. Just to make this even more relevant and more recent, this was some data from a polypay producer up in northern Michigan who sent me fecal samples and just wanted to do this entire research project on his own sheep. So he had a group of ewes that did not receive any dewormer. So that was our control group. Their fecal egg count reduction was 12%. So their fecal egg count went down 12% all by itself. Then they used 3 different dewormers. So this would have been Safeguard, Synanthic, and Safeguard, levamisole, and Sidectin, given all at the same time, or given in 3 doses at the same time. And we'll only get a 14% fecal egg count reduction. Safeguard, we actually saw a 28% increase in fecal egg count. And this was across 10 sheep in each one of these, and these were all ewes, not even lambs. Synanthic, we saw a 40% increase in fecal egg counts. Sidectin, we actually got a negative 58%. So that means the fecal egg counts were going down. But just to put this in reference, for a drug to be effective and be recognized as having, or the worms being susceptible to that, we need to see a fecal egg count reduction greater than, or less than negative 96%, right? So we need a 96% reduction, and we're not seeing that here with any of the drugs or any of the combinations of treatments. And oftentimes, sometimes you're better off not deworming them at all as opposed to giving them a dewormer. So again, just for a dewormer to be effective, the fecal egg count reduction needs to be greater than 96% or less than negative 96%. And that's where we're at right now. So what do you do? When the drugs don't work anymore, you can try to feed your way around that. Not everybody can afford to do that or have the resources to get protein out to large bands of ewes that are grazing in Nevada, or like where I grew up in Southern California, we used to have large bands of sheep come through there in the wintertime when they're lambing on their way through, grazing BLM land through there. Not a lot of protein options for supplementing those animals out there. So one of the things that I got into in my graduate career is kind of looking at, in my research area, is looking at the mechanism of parasite resistance. So if we think about a resistant sheep, and I'm going to use this St. Croix sheep, that's what I use as my model for parasite resistance in sheep. So if we look at this, their immune response to the parasite prevents larval establishment. If I don't have larvae that establish, I don't get adults. If I don't have adults, I don't have eggs. I don't have pasture infectivity, and they just lower the amount of worms that are available on pasture because they're not suitable hosts for that parasite. Alternatively, so if you look at this case and look at some of the data that we did when I started at WVU in St. Croix lambs, so we've got a group of lambs that were never infected, and they remain naive, so they're never challenged, never given any worms, and raised in an environment where they're not going to get wormy. That blue line is hidden behind this green line down here. The first time that I give those lambs 10,000 larvae orally in this controlled setting, their fecal egg count goes up to about 3,250. Then the next week it falls down by itself. Now that reduction in fecal egg count is not a function of the animals being dewormed or anything else. This is those animals' immune response to that. They saw it, they got ill with the parasite, they generated an immune response that was effective enough to clear it. Then we took those lambs, rested them for a couple weeks, came back and give them an additional 10,000 larvae. And what did we see from that? Was this green line across the bottom. So that green line across the bottom represents what happens when immunity goes right. When everything happens in your immune response that is supposed to happen. You got exposed to something, you developed an immune response against it, cleared it by yourself, and then when you got exposed again, it never had an opportunity to develop within the host. That is what in the immunology world we call full host protective immunity, because the animal did not have to respond the second, or they responded the second time, but that response prevented the pathogen from expanding within the host. If we look at the amount of larvae that we typically see inside these resistant animals when we harvest them after 10,000, after a dose of 10,000 larvae, you can see that the St. Croix hare lambs are down here around 16, and that's the total number. So remember, we give them 10,000. These guys are at 16. This is at, I think this is 7 days after infection. And these wool lambs, this would be kind of a semi-polypay type sheep. So it had Rambouillet, Finn, and Dorset. It just didn't have any Targhee in there. So these were sheep that Dr. Notter made at Virginia Tech to do his research in kind of shortening anestrus period. These sheep were at 530. So when we get data like this in science, we get pretty excited because it's kind of drive a truck through differences and it's very obvious. With our susceptible sheep, and we saw this before, they allow larvae to establish. So there isn't an immune response to the larvae. They establish, the adults come through, the adults become fecund, they infect the pasture with their larvae, and then this cycle continues. What you hope doesn't happen as a function of this is that you start accumulating host death as a result. And we're managing the sheep correctly and all of those kind of things to prevent this. But sometimes, despite all of our best efforts, we still lose those animals. So if we look at, so I use Suffolk crossbred lambs because I can get them. They're pretty cheap and available on this side of the country. So I take those Suffolk crossbred lambs and I compare them to the St. Croix in their response to parasites. So we do everything the same with them. We raise them on an elevated floor barn. We reduce their exposure. So we have parasite naive sheep, and that's that blue line right across the bottom. The first time we give them worms, so we're giving them the same dose we gave the St. Croix, they go up to 7,000 eggs per gram. And that stays up there. Now, I've been explaining this for 15 years, but this line drops down right here because when the staff was feeding those animals, they just threw a bale of hay in, everybody got diarrhea, and diarrhea dilutes fecal egg count. So that's why it drops off right there. It's not a deworming, or they didn't magically get rid of the parasites, because they came back. If you look next week, they come right back. So that's what happens. So in the primary infection, they go up here. When we challenge infect those sheep or give them a second dose after the primary dose, they can't develop full host protective immunity like we saw in the St. Croix sheep. So the mechanism of all of this is this immune response, right? The mechanism of parasite resistance is just a better immune response in sheep. And don't get lost with all the acronyms in immunology. Just think about all the things that are happening. There are different cells, there's antibodies, there's cytokines or the hormones of the immune system that cause or that facilitate communication between immune cells and what's happening in local environments. These are all a part of everything that's happening with the St. Croix sheep. So effectively, they are finding a way to do this. I put this in here because it's something my dad used to say, and I've heard it from other people. A sheep will search its entire life to find a way to kill itself. And I think there's a part of it that's true. I also think some of it is that we don't catch some of those sick sheep quite as quickly as we'd like to in terms of our management programs. Which leads us to kind of this next area of research that we got into probably about 7 or 8 years ago. It was taking Katahdin sheep. And if you're not familiar with Katahdin sheep, they were sheep that were developed in the 50s in Maine. They're a composite breed that utilizes a bunch of different breeds, but primarily the St. Croix breed with a dash of Wiltshire Horn and Suffolk and a lot of other breeds that went into making this composite breed. So it's a hare breed. The intent behind this breed was to be disease resistant, low input cost maternal ewe line. So it was supposed to be kind of a low input maternal line ewe that could be used in terminal sire matings. Pretty much, if you want to think of it this way, it's a polypay with hair, right? And I think that's a pretty good analogy for what St. Croix sheep are. Our research project that we were doing, this is a project that we're doing in cooperation with Virginia Tech, is utilizing their flock and then taking sires that had either very low fecal lay count breeding value, so that would be the low PFEC sired lambs, and then mating those randomly to a group of ewes. And then we take the other side of that, and that would be the high fecal lay count EBV sired rams. So those would be more parasite susceptible type of rams, and bred them to the same ewe flock, right? So within the year, we just broke the ewe flock up between these two groups of rams and evaluated their lamb's performance on pasture. And then we did some other studies with them. One of the things that one of my graduate students found, and this is Dr. Andrew Weaver from NC State. This was his project to start out when he was doing his PhD here. So in 2018, he came to me and said, we've got a 20% difference in death loss just based on sire alone. And the death loss that we're looking at had nothing to do with parasites, or at least not directly, right? So we can't say that their death was absolutely due to parasites, but what we can say is that most of the death loss that we're seeing here happened after day 7, went up to 2 weeks post-weaning, and was not a primary cause of parasites. So this was stuff like pneumonia. We had bad feet, pneumonia, a lot of other diseases that were happening in those animals, and not necessarily parasitism. What happened this particular year is that we had an outbreak of Clostridium type A in Southwest Virginia and going down towards Tennessee. So that prompted us to vaccinate all the sheep for Clostridium A the following year, and that is resulting in this reduction in death loss. But if you look at the low sired lambs, regardless if they're in a dirty environment or a clean environment after they've been vaccinated, their death loss goes down a little bit, but not as substantially as what we see in these lambs. So when you have a dirty environment and you're using high PFEC EBV rams, you're more likely to have lambs that die to a variety of different diseases outside of parasitism. Then after 2019, what we started to do was to divergently mate both the rams and the ewes. So now we took any ewe that was less than breed average, she went to a negative ram. Any ewe that was above breed average for that trait, she went to the positive rams. And you can see that discrepancy between survivability between the groups as it's carried on year after year. So it got us thinking about how do we begin to understand immune competence? Because to me, this isn't a parasite issue anymore. This is an issue of I have some sheep that are immune competent and I have some that are incompetent because they're dying. So we started to think about that. And to me, the logical thing was to look at some of these, to look at other things that were going on. So remember, we're seeing a 20% death loss. Both genotypes are exposed to this dirty environment. They're surviving despite this high parasite load. So this is what came to my mind with all of this, is that no matter where you are, most producers are giving a Clostridium perfringens vaccination at some point in that lamb's life. And we were going to do it they were going to do that as a part of their management practice at the experiment station in Virginia. So our idea was then to use this and then measure antibody response after those animals had received a CD&T vaccination. So if you look at this, I pulled this graphic from a textbook. You can find these just about anywhere. If we look at total IgG, that's immunoglobulin G, that is produced in response to a vaccine. The first time you give it, it goes up and then it comes down. And so IgM is going to have a lower response initially. But if you look at the second time, it has a much higher response. That's a booster response. And that's what we expect to see with all of this stuff. All right, so what we did, and this happened right during COVID year, I had a student that, and the way that we had to do that is the student had to drive 4.5 hours down to Southwest Virginia, collect those samples, turn around, drive back the same day because you couldn't stay overnight because of COVID. I guess that's how it spread. Anyway, what we're looking at here is the IgG response in Katahdin lambs and how that varies based on their PFEC, or post-weaning fecal egg count, estimated breeding value. So we broke this up by 3 different groups. If you were less than -50, so those are the super parasite resistant Katahdin lambs. The ones that are in this mid-level, so that's -50 to +50, I call this kind of a random grab bag. You never know what you're going to get in that area. You could get really susceptible lambs, really resistant lambs. It just depends on what's going on there. It's a highly volatile area in terms of predictability. And then the high, that's greater than +50. So their EBV, those sheep would be the more parasite susceptible sheep. What we found in terms of their average serum IgG, or their for each week here, so week 0 would be when they got their first injection, is that the low PFEC lambs generate higher amounts of IgG. Then it comes down, and then this week 4 is when they get their booster shot. And if you look here, 1 week after that booster, they're significantly higher than what we see with the high PFEC lambs. Now, the mids, like I said before, are kind of a mixed bag. You never know what you're going to get, but in this case, they tend to follow the lows with that, which gives us a really good idea of what's happening here, is that sheep that are more parasite resistant might be more immune competent. What are other ways to look at this? So Dr. Weaver went through and looked at lambing records at the Southwest Experiment Station, or the Experiment Station in Southwest Virginia. As a percentage of the number of ewes lambing, how many were culled due to mastitis? If their fecal egg count breeding value was low, meaning that it was less than average, their likelihood of being culled for mastitis was about 2.2%, versus the high fecal egg count EBV sheep, they were at 12.5%. Then I had this really wonderful student. She is now at, she's the sheep extension specialist at Kansas State. Her idea was, and this is completely her idea, she wanted to look at the amount of IgG that was, or antibody that was in colostrum of sheep that were different in their genotypes, or their fecal egg count breeding values. So in this case, we just took, the first year we took really low ewes, took 15 really low ewes and 15 really high. So not just below breed average, they were way below breed average. They were superstars, really parasite resistant ewes, or really parasite susceptible ewes. We get a 2.5-fold difference in the amount of antibody that is in colostrum in those ewes alone. We replicated that the next year, and then we just did the entire flock. So Dr. Meyerly was one of my other students who works for Lamb Board. We were in a hotel room talking about this, and he said, hey, we need to do everybody. So by doing everybody, what we're really able to do was to see that this, what we had the first year on 15 ewes in each group, was replicated the next year, because these ewes were a part of this, plus another 25 ewes in each group, and we got the same numbers. So that was really exciting to us. The other thing that we think about this is that these sheep were, Katahdin sheep are made up of a bunch of different breeds, but primarily St. Croix, right? And that's what we kind of link a lot of this stuff back to. So we set up an experiment where we were going to look at St. Croix versus Suffolk sheep and their response to disease, both behavioral and physiological. The only way that we can replicate a bacterial infection in kind of a livestock setting is to give animals a component of bacteria, which is called lipopolysaccharide. So if I take lipopolysaccharide and I inject it intravenously, those sheep will get a fever within 30 minutes to 2 hours after injection. They will spike a fever, and then over about a period of 12 hours, the fever will dissipate. The other thing that we can look at, and I think this is probably driving more of our treatment decisions, is the behavior in the animals. So another thing, I tell my students this all the time, is that a sheep's ear are kind of a window to their soul and what's happening in their body. But there's a more appropriate or more scientific method of evaluating pain in sheep, and that's called a sheep grimace score. So we can look at orbital tightening, how close they have their eyes closed, their head and ear position. If their head's up, ears are up, they're pretty normal. Once their ears start going down, they start sagging their head. They're not feeling as well. And then also a Fleming response. So we had 10 Suffolks, 10 St. Croix sheep in this group, and we gave them LPS. So we looked at their average sheep grimace score, and both of them go up, right, because they're getting sick. The St. Croix don't go quite as high as the Suffolks, but that doesn't matter. The Suffolks start feeling the pain early, and then the pain is there for quite a while. By 5.5 hours after this experiment, after we did this, the St. Croix sheep were back to normal, eating, chewing their cud, behaving like normal sheep. And I think what says this best is this video. So these are these sheep 6 hours after they were injected with LPS. So here's this group of these 10 sheep, and I had a student go in there every half hour and stir the pen. So we took videos of this, and I had another student come through and do all the grimace scores on every single sheep through here. So they got to watch a lot of sheep videos. But you can see that everybody responded. They got up, they moved away from the person or the stimulus that came into that pen. All right, so everybody has that in their head. We'll go to our next slide. Here's our Suffolk pen. And you can see a remarkable difference in the behavior of the animals. We have our student that walks into the pen. I see the gate trying to move. And she has to physically move the animals to get them to respond. And they don't get up. Remember that this is 6 hours after this has happened. If you see sheep that behave like this, what is your tendency for treatment? So this, coupled with the fact that they had a fever, would increase their likelihood of receiving some sort of antimicrobial. In this case, what we're looking at here are sheep that are poorly responding to this, and it's having systemic effects on them. So we actually see in a lot of these sheep, when we start looking at their biochemical responses, we see more of, you heard this during COVID, a cytokine storm that happens inside this. A couple of these animals, as a result of this project, actually died from the immune response that was generated to what we gave them. So the whole idea here is that, or thinking about whether or not parasite-resistant sheep are just more immune competent. Is that it? Is it that simple? So there's problems with the fecal A count breeding value. And I think that's one of our big ways of identifying immune competent sheep. We have a breeding value that's available through NSIP for most of the breeds that participate in NSIP. But there are inherent problems with the fecal A count breeding value. I just want to spend a minute talking about those. This is going to vary wildly depending on exposure, and it is environmentally and climatically dependent. So while yes, in the southeastern United States, parasites are a big concern for us as you move out into West Texas or the Intermountain regions, or even in the desert of Southern California where I'm from, we don't see a big problem with parasites. So, but that's going to vary once a rain comes through. If you've got some irrigated pastures, those kind of things are going to cause differences in fecal A counts. If you are taking a fecal sample on ewes in December in Minnesota versus December in Georgia, there's going to be differences in the samples that we get on those animals. The other thing is for this EBV to be calculated, the contemporary group has to have an average of at least 500 eggs per gram. That gives the quantitative geneticist an idea that yes, everybody was exposed to some level of parasitism and they all have a strongyl egg count, or the group has a strongyl egg count that is above 500. That allows us to calculate significant differences, or at least some differences between the animals. This is where it gets a little bit tricky mathematically, is that fecal A count, EBV, is negatively bounded. So you can't have anything less than negative 100. So if you have, so let's say our contemporary group average is 500. And the way the calculation works for fecal A count reduction, and that's effectively what the EBV It is that individual's egg count. Let's say they had a 0. 0 minus 500 is negative 500, divided by 500. That's the contemporary group average. That is a maximum of negative 100. So you can't go any lower than that. It's impossible. But on the other side, it's infinite. You can be infinitely positive through that, which may not matter a lot to most producers, but when you start trying to pull apart differences in animals with the negative bounding on this, it becomes a little bit harder to pull apart some of those differences. The other thing that these fecal egg counts are based on is the strongylid egg type. Now we have multiple species of trichostrongylid parasites that all share very similar features of their eggs, and it's very difficult, close to impossible, to differentiate them in any high throughput counting system or a high throughput counting system. So we just count strongylid egg types, and that may not always be Homunculus. And in some areas, maybe Trichostrongylus is more important, or Telodrosogia is more important. But I would say across multiple environments, Homunculus is going to be the most pathogenic parasite. But that strongylid egg type is not always Homunculus. Then this final idea of the algebra of a 0. So Dr. Lewis from the University of Nebraska dropped this on me a few years ago. He said, Scott, what does a 0 fecal egg count mean? And as somebody who studies this, I said, well, that would mean that they don't. Well, it would depend, right? It would depend on what they're being compared to. And then I started thinking about all the crazy things that this could depend on. What environment did they come from? Did the contemporary group average have enough exposure to this? Nobody knows what a 0 means without some of that other information. And some places may not get a fecal egg count. If you are growing lambs in a feedlot in Northwest Iowa, you may not get exposure to a lot of parasites. So you won't have access to that EBV with direct phenotypic information coming from those animals. You would just be relying on pedigree data or relatives that come from areas where they do calculate that. So it dawned on me one day before I was getting surgery on my knee, and I was going over in my head when I was mowing the lawn one day, that antibody never goes down to 0. You'll never have a sheep with an antibody level of 0 unless they were completely B cell deficient, and that animal probably wouldn't be alive for very long, right? Antibody can always be measured in response to something, right? So we can measure it as a response that hyperimmunized animals are going to generate a larger immune response to this. So I'm going to take you back to this. Remember this picture I pulled from the textbook. Remember what those information, or what that total IgG looked like after a CD&T vaccination. So there's something that is similar here. We're seeing that response that's in fact following those textbook guidelines, but with different levels in those animals. So what I did was I took my students' data from 1 week after they got that booster shot of CD&T. And what we see here is we get an average of about 1,988 micrograms per milliliter. That's this red line that goes across here. We have a negative correlation between fecal egg count, breeding value, and immunoglobulin G, right? So the higher your fecal egg count gets, the lower the antibody level is, right? So that's that negative correlation. But when we get over here, remember everything gets bounded. And when it gets bounded, it gets squished together, and it doesn't allow us to separate those individuals as much as they're separated out here. So if we look at this negative 100 to positive 100 area, we have some different quadrants that we can apply some selection to. If we want sheep that are really good in their antibody response and negative on their fecal egg count, we can pull individuals from these quadrants and identify superior animals that result from that. If we look at those animals that were above and below average on their antibody response, if they were below average, their fecal egg count breeding value was like a 38 or 39 on average. If they were below average on their antibody level, then their fecal egg count breeding value on average was negative 20. You can see that we have a deviation in the antibody response to CD&T vaccination. And this is just a deviation from the mean. Anytime that you see plots like this, you want to see those lines go in different directions, because that says that this might be a trait that we can apply some selection to and make improvements in that particular field. So I kind of coined this phrase in response to Dr. Lewis, was that the algebra of selection for antibody response, or what is the algebra of selection for antibody response? So based on poultry data, so they've been doing this for decades in the poultry industry, or actually in poultry research at Virginia Tech. They have selected birds to be high antibody responders and low antibody responders. And what they've seen as a result of the 6 decades of experience with this is that there's no meaningful impact on performance. And so that the high responder birds have equivalent growth rates to low responder birds. So by selecting for this, we're not necessarily impacting economic drivers of production from the poultry side of that, which gives us hope, right? So if we're selecting for immune response, what we hope that doesn't happen is we get lower growth rates or lower performance in those animals. The nice thing about antibody is that it has a dynamic range of values. So it gives us a selectable range and allows us to look at some of those kind of things. There is some relationship with the fecal egg count breeding value. And to me, this kind of gives me hope thinking about the creation of a health index for sheep. And finally, this may assist producers in areas with low exposure to parasites and permit for selection of health traits. Really kind of thinking about the possibility of true antibiotic-free lamb that's not just affidavit-based. But there's some speed bumps ahead, right? It's not an easy sample to get. You've got to have a blood sample. You have to keep it frozen. You have to ship it. It's very sensitive to some of the timing around those type of testing. The cost of testing, doing this, the old way, and I'll explain this more in the next slide. The way that we used to do this in my lab is based off an assay I developed when I was a graduate student, and that assay is very cheap. The only problem is it takes 5 hours to do it. So a sample takes 5 hours. I can do 48 at a time, but that's it, right? So I'm limited by the number of samples I can do at one time, and it takes 5 hours, and you have no idea if it's gonna, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It's a little bit of a finicky assay. So there's some problems with that. So we have a need for a high throughput assay. I'll share with you some data that says that we might be on the track on that. Then finally, how do we realize the effect of selection? And this is something that a question that's in my mind on a regular basis is how do I know that I've made any improvement with this? Is it just animals are surviving better? Do I see some other differences? What is the outcome of selection for this particular trait? And how do I realize that? So before I leave you guys, I just wanted to address this part of it. So while we were at the Lamb Summit this summer, what I had done before I went out to Idaho for that conference was I ordered a new, there's a new IgG assay that was created about a year and a half ago. And it is a high throughput assay that takes 15 minutes. I didn't know if it worked across species. So when I got back from Lamb Board, or the Lamb Summit, I worked with the people at the company that makes this assay, and we tested it on sheep IgG that we can actually buy from some of the chemical stores that supply universities. I can get sheep IgG. We tested it against a standard curve. It worked beautifully. I don't think I've been out of the lab much more than a few days or so. We've processed about 750 samples in the last month and a half. And just to share with you some of the data that we're getting, this is off a Katahdin flock and that I work with down in Southwest Virginia. This is the 2024 lamb crop. So there's 157 lambs that we did here. We've got 6 different sires represented across there. And you can see sire effects on their average. So this IgG is their lamb's average IgG as we go through here. And then there's some relationship with fecal egg count and some not. So We have, so the great thing about this is that IgG is very normally distributed, so it makes doing statistics on it very easy. But this VPI 102 RAM is a clear rock star when we start looking at this versus this RAM over here, which is not. And if you look at how many babies they have, this one's got 28 lambs on the ground, and then the VPI 102 RAM's got 28 lambs on the ground. So this is based off of those close to 60 lambs that we had, and we're getting extreme differences in averages between those, almost a 10 milligram per milliliter difference in those lambs. So we are super excited about this. I've got data from Polypace, Katahdins. I just did some Shropshire stuff the other day. These are all sheep in NSIP, so we're able to send off these phenotypes and start working on heritability estimates for this particular trait. So with that, I will stop there, and we can talk about some questions and chat more about this.
Well, that was great. Thank you, Dr. Bodridge. So I wanted to, I think since we're so close to you already talking about one of these questions, I'm just going to jump ahead to a question that just came in. So there are a lot of Polypace seed stock producers that test for fecal egg count and EBVs. Some in the Midwest are dry lotting, so it's not possible to do a fecal egg count test on pasture or low exposure. So how can we advance these breeds to have better immune response? And then the question was, well, are there different tests, or is there something else that we can measure? And I think you kind of answered that at the end of this discussion here, but do you want to maybe like wrap it up in an applied sense?
So there's two different ways of looking at this. If we assume, and this is a huge assumption, and I'm throwing out a lot of hypotheticals and theoretical stuff out there. If fecal egg count is linked to this antibody response, then you may not have to do the fecal egg counts themselves. So we've been working with the Polypace breeder in northern Michigan. This last year, last December, what we did is we took fecal egg counts from those lambs and at weaning, which would have been in like late October, November, and then we took a blood sample on those ewes in December, 1 week after their booster vaccination. So we're able to kind of compare that. I don't want to give away everything that's happened with that yet because it's not perfect, but there's some relationship there. It's not as high as we would have hoped it would be. But the other thing that we can do is some of the stuff I've been doing with Katahdin breeders is where you can infect the animals yourselves. And in a feedlot environment, one of the things that we do through West Virginia University is we do fecal egg counts for producers. I've also supplied larvae to producers across the country to evaluate parasite resistance within their flocks. So that would be another way of doing an artificial infection on those lambs that are in a feedlot environment. Might be an opportunity for you to gather those data, at least relevant to that flock, and then start generating some numbers in NSIP.
That's great. Yeah, I'm very interested on the way you're selecting for the antibodies, how it's been modeled with poultry and not affecting the performance. I think that's a big thing people are worried about as they select for animals that have greater and greater parasite resistance.
Yep.
A question came through and kind of more of a story, but a question nonetheless. It says that they have been raising and keeping Katahdins using rotational grazing for over 20 years and currently have 22 breeding ewes and have never really dewormed. So recently they had a ewe die, and from what they can tell, it was due to worms. Should they be concerned about their other ewes? Is this situation common? It's just surprising to them after not deworming and selecting for animals that do well in their environment. Do these situations pop up?
I think so. So if you think about it this way, if you've got a flock of sheep that has been selected for parasite resistance and you haven't really dewormed them much, you don't have much of a load on the pasture, and then the environment shifts. So what happens is that you can start to get a little bit of genetic drift that occurs just because there hasn't been a ton of exposure to parasites. And then you get an animal that a perfect storm happens where they were stressed, they were immunosuppressed, and they succumbed to the parasite infection, or it overwhelmed that animal during different times. So I don't know. We're all in the sheep business, and we're kind of we've all gotten used to random sheep dying for weird reasons at different times. But I think if the large majority of the flock is doing well with that, then the things that you're doing are on the right track. It's identifying the smallest, and we always say there's the 80-20 rule that comes into play with parasites, that there's 20% of your flock that infects the other 80%. So identifying those 20% on a regular basis and either managing the parasites in them stronger or better, or removing them from the flock is the idea.
Yeah. Probably another question I'd probably have with that is, well, what type of ewes have been brought in, or has it been a closed flock, right?
Right.
So we have one participant that has asked a series of pretty good questions. Um, the first question is, what is the prognosis for new classes of dewormers, if you can speak to those, and that have been released in other regions? Is there any future for them getting approved in the US market? Start Tech is an Australian dewormer that is being touted as the solution for managing resistance. Are there merits to these claims, and do they work with different mechanisms than our dewormers on the market?
So we haven't had a really new dewormer on our market since Sidectin came out and became FDA approved for use in sheep. We won't see anything else come onto our market unless it gets through FDA approval. Zolvex and Monipantal, those drugs have been available in other countries and has shown efficacy as they were, or when they came out. What they found was in 2 to 3 years, because they were used so hard, they got parasite, or they developed drug resistance really quickly to them. I haven't seen much about the StarTech one. I need to look into that to give you an educated response to that. But my thought process with all of this stuff is that any of the new anthelmintics that do come out, they are typically targeting one or two different modes of action have like one or two different modes of action. And that's pretty easy for a parasite that has a really short generation interval to develop some resistance to, or they have already had that within the population, and then that just gets selected for by use of that drug. One of the best things that we can do to maintain the efficacy of our dewormers is to utilize selective deworming strategies like FAMACHA as a means to maintain the efficacy of those dewormers.
Another question that is interesting, is there any concern of autoimmune conditions arising by breeding for a higher immune response? So this goes to the end of your talk.
Yeah.
Certainly that risk currently outweighs the risk of parasite infestation / resistance.
So I've heard people talk about this before, and it's one of those fun things to think about. Typically with selection, what we do is we think about selecting extremes, right? To move the needle, you need to select for extremes. This may be one of those traits where we're selecting for optimums instead of extremes. So we have a lot to learn about this. We're nowhere near the point where we're ready to say we should select for this or not select for this. I think that selection for some of the disease resistance traits could develop in autoimmune disease. I think we've seen some sheep that, like the St. Croix do really great against parasites, but if you give them coccidiosis, they don't respond well to coccidiosis. So there are differences within all of this stuff, and it just depends on how we evaluate this. What we'd like to do is start using some of these moderate or average to high average or superior average antibody rams in some feedlot environments, and look at the development of pneumonia or how many sheep are going through with that are coughing or need different treatments for that. So I think that we're just on the cusp of this stuff. This isn't a cure-all to sheep production in general, but it's one of the things that we are thinking about in terms of selection for optimums as opposed to extremes.
Yeah. Have they seen any of that in the poultry side of things that that model was kind of modeled after a little
Not
bit?
really, and I think some of the early stuff that we're seeing is that there might be some antagonism with maternal traits.
Hmm.
So we have a ton of work to do, Chad.
Yeah.
I I'm kind of excited about this because it gives us a new thing to kind of figure out and how it works. And we've been able to generate so much data so quickly that we're kind of behind on thinking about it.
Oh, well, that's a
Right? That's
great
a good
issue to
problem to
have.
have.
Yeah.
Right?
Um, when going back to all the research you did, and specifically, I think this question was asked when you were showing the slide where they fed the hay and then it diluted your fecal
Yep.
aid count. But they wanted to know when you were measuring fecal aid count, were you doing McMaster slides? How were you measuring that? Mature
Yeah,
larva, what?
we only do McMasters, and the reason is that we're really good at it, and we can do a lot of them very quickly. As soon as you start deviating from that, and you're starting to use Wisconsin tests or even the mini flow tax that have more sensitivity, you decrease the amount of samples you can do in a day, and that is for us, that's a limiting factor for us. So because we're taking these animals and we're getting fecal aid counts from them every week, we're compensating for lack of sensitivity with replication. So that's the way we do that. We do probably about somewhere between 4,500 and 5,500 fecal aid count. Well, we've done somewhere in there, right around 5,000 fecal aid counts this summer for producers across the country. And our fecal aid count results are, you know, they are what they are for the producers that are out there. But I think it's the turnaround time, the speed, and we compensate for some of the lack of accuracy or lack of sensitivity with that test with the replication and the speed at which we can get some of that stuff done.
Well, and is there something to be said also that that's kind of your industry standard for NSIP and things like that?
It is, and there are inherent problems with them. Like I talked about with the what's the algebra of a zero. That's anything less than 50 eggs per gram. One egg on a slide is going to be 50 eggs per gram. So that's the basis sensitivity of a masters. Yes, I could count more slides per animal. I only have, I mean, the way our lab's set up now, we can do somewhere between 150 and 200 samples an hour. And that's because we're all trained, everybody knows what they're doing, and we have a very well-oiled system to get all that stuff done. And there's no way you can't really do that with Wisconsin's or mini FlowTac or some of the other more sensitive assays and get as many of them done as quickly.
Yeah. So I just want to remind our audience, we will try to wrap this up within the hour. A couple questions are coming in. I'm going to combine a couple questions since they both kind of speak to developing medicine or dewormers. Can you speak to BioWorma at all and its efficacy, and then also any development of vaccines to help with the barber pole worm?
So BioWorma is a great product that doesn't necessarily kill worms. What it does is it reduces pasture infectivity. So the way you need to think about BioWorma is reducing the exposure to parasites. And the effect of BioWorma is not going to be as fast as giving the animals a drug. So BioWorma is Dunantonium flagrans. It's a fungus that is fed to animals. And as it passages through the ruminant system, it sporulates. And in the environment, these fungi have these dendrites that wrap around larvae and prevent them from moving and basically developing and moving in the pasture so they can't climb or they can't rise with the dew up and down grass and be consumed by the host. So it is effective, it just takes time. And then there's a lot of strategy around when you feed BioWorma to get its effectiveness. Anybody who's interested in BioWorma and wants a lot more information about it, I would direct you to the wormex.info website, and that's the American Consortium of Small Ruminant or for Small Ruminant Parasite Control. There's a group of like-minded academics that have all gotten on there and provided a lot of work information sheets and strategies about how to utilize different things. In terms of a vaccination, the BarberVax was great. The guy who developed it made it based off of some gut antigens that were available in adult worms. The problem is, to get adult worms, you have to kill sheep to get to them. So you have to grow sheep, kill them, take the adult worms. It's not a recombinant target that is on there. They're actually extracted. That's what caused the availability swings in BarberVax. And at the end of the day, BarberVax had an efficacy of somewhere between 65-70% fecal egg count reduction. So in some areas of the US, that would be effective. In other areas, you're probably better off selecting for sheep that are resistant to the parasite as opposed to utilizing a unreliably available vaccine that was limited to its production in Australia. And I don't even think it was approved for use in the US. So there's some issues with that part of it as well. In terms of anything new coming down the pipeline for that, there's been some new targets that have been identified by some researchers at USDA BARC, and that's the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center. That's part of USDA that's just been doged and kind of shut down. So those guys found some stuff that was interesting, published a paper, and then they are now looking for jobs.
Yeah, it's a lot of stuff with tannins and combination. They've been doing great work.
Yep.
So a bunch of questions are now rolling in. I'm going to take two more to respect your time, Dr. Bodridge, but if you could speak real quick to maybe cover the growing presence of how social media is affecting science. What is there any research out there showing support of using lime? And I'll throw another one on there. Diatomaceous earth is one that I see quite a bit people talk
Okay.
about.
So we'll deal with the lye issue first. If you want to feed sodium hydroxide to your sheep, do it at your own risk. That is an absolutely caustic material that it's as bad. It's almost akin to the selection for autoimmune disease to deal with parasitism. It is just not. There's been a publication that we were forced to put out through the American Consortium of Small Ruminant Parasite Control addressing the lye issue specifically. That is just not a good thing to do. People should not do that. Period. The end. For diatomaceous earth, I hear a lot of anecdotal data. And so this goes back to some research that Dr. Zajac did at Virginia Tech many years ago and tried to prove to people that this doesn't, in a controlled study, we cannot replicate any of the anecdotal evidence that other people had by feeding diatomaceous earth. So I can't say if it were, what I can say is that I can never replicate somebody's anecdote experimentally. And if I can't do that, then there's probably a good chance that there's some other things going on with those animals in that environment that are causing that outside of or as a function of diatomaceous earth. But I've never seen anybody able to replicate that particular study and come up with results that were positive.
Okay. And then lastly, anyone else who has questions, feel free to reach out to any of us that host this monthly webinar. Or I assume they can reach out straight to you, Dr. Bodridge, if that would be okay.
Anytime.
Do you want to give your plug on your information? Then we'll ask you one last question.
Sure. You can find my name is Scott Bowdridge. You can just search me on the Google machine, and my email and university webpage pops up right there. My email address is on there. It's just scott.bowdridge@mail.wvu.edu. feel free to send me an email whenever I answer questions to folks all over the country.
Okay. I would probably even encourage a lot of you to send fecal samples to their lab. They do great work. Last one, I think this applies and covers everything, is what advice would you give to new producers, especially as they get new pastures and try not to bring in worms into their operation?
Well, so the first thing I would caution people against is a goal of sterility. And I think sometimes that's what we want. We don't want our sheep to have exposure to any parasites. I'm I feel that sheep should be exposed to some level of parasites, and they're going to be. And what we don't want that to do, what we don't want to happen with that is to overwhelm the system. So finding a balance between sheep being able to perform despite the parasitic load that they may be exposed to, using genetics, management, different feed, using all the tools in your toolbox to manage those environments, how you graze, how you mow your pastures, when you mow in relationship to when you graze. There's not a simple recommendation that I can give that will work in every environment. Talk to the people who are local. They're the ones that know the most information about that stuff. What I do in West Virginia may not be applicable to what you would do in Western Colorado or Southern California for that matter. So it's all going to depend highly on your environment, the type of sheep you have, and ultimately what the goals of your production system are. What are you doing with those animals?
Yeah, incredible. Okay, well, thank you. We really appreciate your expertise. Some comments have come in that this is among one of the best presentations given on this webinar series, and
Oh, that's
I'd have to
fantastic.
agree. So thank
Thank
you.
you.
Feel free to reach out to any of us. This will be recorded and posted on the University of Idaho YouTube Extension Livestock page, and so feel free to reach out to any of us or look at that page for other questions you may have regarding anything sheep and goat related. So thank you again for joining us, and until next month, we'll see you later. Thank you, Scott.
You're welcome. Easy peasy.
Yeah, see ya. Bye.
All right. Talk to you later.